I'm ready. Okay, good morning, folks. We're in the middle of the topic of Korbanos B'zman Hazeh, of bringing Korbanos B'zman Hazeh, in particular the Korban of Korban Pesach B'zman Hazeh. And when we go into the rationale for bringing Korbanos B'zman Hazeh, we'll see why that's more specific to Korban Pesach. But I said that we were going to say the story of whose idea it was and what exactly happened this week. So let's start with the story. The Ottoman Empire ruled Eretz Yisrael for hundreds of years. The Ottoman Empire ruled, big swaths of the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. It only ended in World War I. The Ottoman Empire only collapsed fully in World War I. For years, for decades, the Ottoman Empire was referred to as the sick man of Europe. It just lingered around. It was a big empire, but it couldn't really sustain itself. Now, during the early 1800s, during Napoleon's battles, Napoleon battled with the Ottoman Empire and tried to conquer Eretz Yisrael. Egypt, Eretz Yisrael. If you've been to Yaffo, there's a lot of things related to the Napoleonic Wars. Up the coast of Israel is where Napoleon tried to come from, and there's a lot of different artifacts and history related to Napoleon's battles. Now, the Ottoman Empire was like a big conglomerate, and it had various strong generals placed in different parts of the empire. And one of the strongest fighting elements of the Ottoman Empire at that time was the Pasha of Egypt. His name was Ali. I think he's actually Muhammad Ali. Pasha Ali. And he was a great general, a great tactician. And he's the one who engineered the victory of the Ottoman Empire against Napoleon. And being full of steam, he had just won a monumental battle. It was in the early 1800s. He revolted against the chief Pasha of the Ottoman Empire, who was based in Turkey. And he took control of Egypt and Eretz Yisrael and a few of those local areas over there for a short amount of time. Now, him and his son Ibrahim Pasha, who took over after him, ruled, it's 20, maybe 20-ish years of rule, Sachakol, that they ruled for. It was considered like the golden age for Jews, the Yishuv HaYashan, because Ibrahim Pasha and Ali Ali Pasha, whatever he called himself, were much more lenient and manageable. They were workable in regards to Jews and Jews' rights in Eretz Yisrael in comparison to the Ottoman Empire. Now, in that moment in time, it's mamash like a moment in time that happened, that there was a little bit of the foot was taken off the neck in Eretz Yisrael for a few minutes, steps in Reb Tzvi Kalisher with a grand idea. Now, Reb Tzvi Kalisher, just to give you his background, he's born Pachas Yosh to the end of the 1700s. He's born in Lisa, actually the town where the Nesivis is the Rav, Rabbi Yaakov Loberbaum. He learns by the Nesivis as a young bacher when he's 12, 13, 14. Eventually, he moves over to a bigger city, slightly in that vicinity, the bigger city, which was Pozna, which was Rabbi Akiva Eiger's city. Rabbi Akiva Eiger is the Rav, and he has the distinction and the schos of being a Talmud of the Nesivis and Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and a real Talmud. He wrote with both of them, he corresponded to both of them, he was close to both of them. Talmud of the Nesivis and Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And I think he considered Rabbi Akiva Eiger to be his Rebbe Muvik, like his primary Rebbe. He moved over to Pozna. Eventually, he marries a girl from a city called Turin, which is a city in Prussia, I think. He moves there. He gets supported by his shver. Eventually, he becomes the Rav of Turin. He writes many svarim. He writes a sefer on Chayshim Mishpat, like a regular lamdish sefer, like Kilo Al Derech the Nesivis, Al Derech is Rebbeim on Chayshim Mishpat. He also writes a sefer about Jewish philosophy, which is makes him stand out a little bit. He corresponds with Moses Mendelssohn, Naftali Hertz Wiesel, some of the earliest, Maskilim reformers. He corresponds with them. He has respect for their chachma, but at the same time, he battles vociferously against their innovations. He was a big fighter against the reform. He put a kol kairos. And, amongst this whole potpourri of interesting type of characteristics that he was a tremendous lover of Eretz Yisrael. He's considered from the group, you'd call him the proto-Zionist, meaning he predates the Zionist movement, but he shared many Zionist ideals. He wanted to start an agricultural settlement in Eretz Yisrael. He tried many times to get there. He's part of a small group like, Shmuel Moalever, Rabbi Yaakov Reinis, Reb Tzvi Kalisher, Rabbi Elio Greiditz. There's a few of these proto-Zionists who were very, very Haredi, be'etzem, but shared certain ideas that later on became very integral parts of the Zionist movement. So now, in this moment of time, when Ali becomes the king of Israel, of Palestine, or whatever you want to call it, he decides that he's going to make a push to reinstitute Korbanos. He felt that Ali Pasha would be chilled enough to allow Jews to bring Korbanos on Har Bayis. He was mistaken about that. He was wrong, but he thought that, and he decides to make a push. Now, interestingly, the way he goes about this push is like this. In the non-Jewish world, in the anti-Semitic world, there's an enduring conspiracy theory that goes on for hundreds of years that the Rothschild family and Kilu Jews rule the world. Right? This is a very, very famous conspiracy theory. Now, it's based on a kernel of truth. During the early 1800s, when the Rothschild family was Bishei Tefartim, at the strength of the peak of their powers, they kind of did rule the world, meaning the known world, the European world. They had a bank in France, they had a bank in England, they had a bank in Germany, they had a bank in Italy, and they had a bank, I forgot the fifth location. These are all, the founder of the Rothschild family is Meir Amschel Rothschild. He lived in Frankfurt, Germany. He's actually, I think, a relative of the Chavas Yair, Rav Yair Bachrach. The original family name is Bachrach, a nice Jewish German family name. Rothschild, I think, just means red house, which was the home that the head of the Rothschild family built, and they took the name of the home. Eventually, his children, he sends them all out to different corners of Europe, and for a certain tkuf in time, they were taka ruling the world. Meaning, I think one of them, in a moment of openness, said that he who controls the money of the British Empire controls the British Empire, and everybody knows the British Empire controls the world. So, do the math. They funded both sides of the war in the Napoleonic Wars, meaning kings on either side who were battling each other needed funds. The bonds were issued by the Rothschild banks, different branches of the Rothschild banks, but issued. So they were really running the world. Eventually, they kind of faded away. I think still, if you try to look up their net worth, they're a fabulously wealthy family. It just now has thousands of members and tens of banks, so it's hard to put together who's who. So Reb Tzvi Kalisher also kind of bought into this idea that the Rothschilds with their money control the world, and he sent a letter to Usher Anshel Rothschild, which was the head of the bank in, I think, Paris, which ultimately became he was the Reish Mishpacha at the time. This is like in the years, I'm not sharp here on the years, but like 1820s maybe, early 1820s, he sends a letter to Usher Anshel Rothschild, which is actually preserved, his letter. In the back of this reprinted Rishas Tzion, L'shtickle show and tell, this is his letter. It's like pages and pages. This is his letter that he sent in Hebrew, to Usher Anshel Rothschild, with his whole hamtzah of what he thinks should be the move over here. And basically his idea was that Ali Pasha needs money. He's battling with the Ottomans. He's going to need money. The Rothschild Bank should offer to fund him, to give him the money that he needs, and therefore buy off Eretz Yisrael from him. You'll buy off Eretz Yisrael from him, and when you own Eretz Yisrael, he says, don't worry, you'll make your money back. Because eventually, if a Jew owns Eretz Yisrael, many more Jews will come, and eventually we'll be able to bring Korbanos, and more Jews will want to come. You'll sell houses, you'll own farms, and you'll make all your money back. It's just a long-term investment. See the long-term picture. Buy Eretz Yisrael off Ali Pasha, you'll make all your money back, and everything. Now, part of his letter that he writes over here is this idea. Now, the first few chapters of it, and later he publishes a sefer called Rishas Tzion, which is elaborating on the themes that he wrote in this letter to Usher Anshel Rothschild, and the themes basically starts as follows. He believes, based on different rayas from Sukkim and Chazals and etc., that Mashiach is not going to be a process that's initiated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Mashiach is something that you don't wait for. Mashiach, is supposed to be something that you do to get Mashiach to come. Like Mashiach comes up b'derech hateva, call it. And this is a philosophical shaila, and there's a lot of nuances to this, and I'm generalizing when I say that, but he believed that Yidden could do something to try to cause that to happen. And one of the primary things that he thought that Yidden should do to do it is to bring Korbanos back. So he starts off with this idea that Mashiach is something that we need to, get the ball rolling. And then he continues on to the fact that Jews who will be able to bring Korbanos will be able to get that started again. Now, he was a young man when he wrote this. I don't know, he's probably 30. He's a young man when he wrote his first letter to Usher Anshel Rothschild. He was full of, he was just excited. He wrote the letter. But he also, at the same time, in 1836, a little bit later, now we don't know if Usher Anshel Rothschild ever responded to him, actually. We have no records that he responded to him. He might have received this letter and said, here, cute, and threw it in the garbage. We have no idea that he even took it seriously. The whole thing, it's unknown how it was received by the other party. But for the rest of his life, Reb Tzvi Kalisher was dedicated to this mission of pushing Korbanos B'Zman Hazeh, bringing back Korbanos B'Zman Hazeh, and to the end, he wrote a whole sefer called Rishas Tzion, which is all the rationales, the halachic rationales, the makaris from Chazal, from Nevi'im, from Midrashim, that support his idea of bringing back Karbanos Mizman Hazeh. Now, he wrote to his Rebbe, now I want to try to go through some of the halachic shaylos disputes, underpinnings of this thing that he wrote, but there's a lot of them, so we'll try to just go quickly. I'm not going to go into too much detail on any one of them. But the basic premise starts as follows. He believes as follows. There is a Sefer Kafta V'Ferach from a Rishtari Aparchi, a Rishon, who traveled around the world in the, I think, 1100s, 1200s. He traveled around the world. He wrote a travelogue. Now, when he got to Eretz Yisrael, he writes that he met people, and this is not too long after this would have happened, and I'll read from you. He says he met as follows. He met people who told him, Rabbeinu Yechiel de Paris, Rabbeinu Yechiel of Paris, one of the last Bali Ataisvis, Amar Lavi Yerushalayim, wanted to come to Yerushalayim, V'hu b'shna Sheva Yisrael Elef Hashishi, V'sheyakrev Karbanos Mizman Hazeh. Rabbeinu Yechiel de Paris wanted to come to Yerushalayim and bring Karbanos Mizman Hazeh. Now, he writes that in the moment he was so stunned by this that he forgot to even ask his kashis, what could be wrong with this. And then he has a little bit of a pilpul, about Tumah Bizman Hazeh, Ahin, Aher, back and forth. Now, whether or not this actually ever happened, that Yechiel Paris came to Eretz Yisrael and was Makav Karbanos or wanted to be Makav Karbanos is a point of great machlekes. There are many later Chacham who believe that this never happened. This was aspirational. Yechiel Paris wished he could come to Eretz Yisrael. It was like Begeder Masi Aval Yadi V'Akemena. He wished, like the Goyin wanted to go, he wished that he could go to Eretz Yisrael and bring Karbanos, but it's not something that ever happened. But Yiach Shia, this Kafta V'Ferach is where, it spawns the idea that, hey, maybe this is really possible. Maybe this could really be done. So it starts with Shir Kalasha with the Yisayistik Machlekes that's really in the Gemara in several places. And that's a Machlekes if one could bring Karbanos Bizman Hazeh. Now there's Gemara in Megillah, there's Gemara in Zvachim, the Gemara elsewhere makes reference to it, that Shamati, Shemakrivim Beis Chanyu Bizman Hazeh. I heard that there's such a thing as bringing Karbanos. Beis Chanyu was not the Beis HaMikdash, it was in Alexandria, it was an outside element. And I heard that you could bring Karbanos Bizman Hazeh. Now the Gemara brings Machlekes Tanoi, it's Machlekes Tanoim, if you're allowed to bring Karbanos Bizman Hazeh. Taisvis has a handle Rai, what these Mandamrim hold, and I'm just going through quickly the Rashi Prakam here, but the Rambam is the famous one who actually turns this into something that you can work with. The Rambam in Hilchos Beis HaBechira in Perek Vav, the Rambam says as follows. He says, Lefichach, he starts like this. He says, the Kedusha Rishayna, Shekitcha Shleima, Shu Kiddush HaZar of Yerushalayim, L'Shaita, V'Kiddush HaYisrael L'Asad Lavai. That Kedusha was Chal, L'Shaita, and L'Asad Lavai. The Kedusha that Shlomo Melech was Mekadosh of the Azara and the Beis HaMikdash and Yerushalayim, that's a Kedusha that has the ability to maintain even through Galus. So says the Rambam in Halachat Tezvav, Lefichach, Makrivim HaKarbanos Kulan, Afal Bi She'ein Sham Bayis Banei. One is allowed to bring all the Karbanos even though there's no Bayis Banei, even though there's not a Beis HaMikdash that's built. Why? The Kedusha of Yerushalayim and the Mikdash comes from the Shechina, and the Shechina is not batal. Even though they're destroyed, they stay in their Kedusha. So the Rambam says, all Karbanos, technically, in theory, theoretically, any carbon could be brought even Bizman Hazeh, even without a Beis HaMikdash. Comes the Ravid. The Ravid says, no, this is not true. That's Lamandam. He says, Lamandam Kedusha Rishayna Lo Kitchel Asad Lavai. The Ravid's chaylik, and he says we don't pass like that mandamer. Now the Rambam elsewhere in Meiser Karbanos says the same thing. But this is like you say this thing based on one of the mandamer in the Gemara, and based on, so to speak, the Meiser Rav of Rav Yechiel Paris and the Rambam's Deya. It seems like it's pretty clear that even if there's no Beis HaMikdash, one could bring Karbanos. So still, there's some missing elements. You have to fill in the blanks, but in theory, one could bring Karbanos. Now, to this, Reb Tzvi Kalisha wrote a letter to his Rebbe Reb Kiveger, suggesting that based on the Rambam and based on his estimation that it's important and that Klal Yisrael should be trying to do this, we should be trying to reinitiate the Avodas HaKarbanos and bring Karbanos Bizman Hazeh. Now, Reb Kiveger writes back as follows. Reb Kiveger is in the last months of his life. Reb Kiveger is a very, very old man. I mean, not very old, very, very infirm, let's say. Reb Kiveger, I think Reb Kiveger was like low 70s when he was niftas. I don't think he was very old, but Reb Kiveger writes back, this is in 1836, Reb Kiveger writes as follows. And pay attention to this nuance, because you can see this in a lot of the chuvas that people write. It's like this. Begufa inyan, eini maskim. The whole matarao here that you have here, I'm not maskim. Ki gam koidim sheyadenu magas, ladim beplugta the Rebusa, Rambam Aravid. Before we start handling this question of the Rambam and the Ravid, and before we start daning on where the Mizbeach goes and what the dimensions of the Mizbeach has to be, the Tvachim, big ones, small ones, which is very hard to do, meaning all these things that the Rebbe just brushed by, he says, are very hard to actually get a clear handle on it. Before we start that, he says, there's a different problem. What about kahuna? So now, I just want to point, before I go into his details about kahuna, you'll notice this pattern. A lot of the tshuvas that people write about it, there'll be like a quick brush by like, milvad that there's 12 things that don't really shtim, that are hard to put, but lamaisa, let's handle this. And then they'll go through an inyan, like Lamashal B'Kneger goes through the idea of kahuna, and on the kahuna inyan, he's not too anti, he's, noita that it could work, and Rav Tzir Kalisha writes back to him to be miyash for some of his kashas, and then forever after that, in all the decades of Rav Tzir Kalisha's life, Rav Tzir Kalisha maintained that Rav Kneger was maskim to his amtzah. And you'll see this in the Chassam Sofer's letter also. The Chassam Sofer will write, a great idea, I love it, it's not really practical. Okay, let me handle one or two nekudas from Yeshayla, and he doesn't come out against it, and Rav Tzir Kalisha added him to his list, the Chassam Sofer was maskim. Meaning in every letter that Rav Tzir Kalisha wrote later on, he would say that the Chassam Sofer was maskim, Rabbi Kneger was maskim, Rabbi Leo Gutmacher was maskim. I just want to point out this nuance, and this is not me saying this, I'll show you who this really comes from, but just notice Rabbi Kneger starts off right at the gate, that I'm not even going into the things that I hold have no yishuv. The things that are not miyushavable, I'm not talking about. But this kahuna thing, Kneger starts off, and he handles the shaila, what's the gather of kehanim bizman hazeh? Are kehanim bizman hazeh considered real kehanim? Are the kehanim b'chazaka? Kneger actually collects like a lot of gedolei achronim, and he's mesakim as follows. He says, Mikol makim, kivin the gedolei rabbeinu, harivash, marit, marshal, chutashani, marash yafa, danuoisim l'sveikis, they were machriya, that kehanim bizman hazeh are only called misafik, shaloi lahatilem shum davar sha'asul lazarim, ech nimsalem lavad avodah. Kneger says, yeah, we treat them like kehanim misafik, but we're not going to be giving them things that are asur for a zar to do. To let them go do avodah, which is asur for a zar, that you can't let them do. And Kneger ends off, fine, halavai, we should be able to. Then he says, he throws in also that big day kahuna need tchelas, which they didn't have at that time. And he ends off, ve'ein biyadeinu lasis had shiyara Hashem mimakim rucha yaleinu lahavi agula amiti laharves betzedek. We have to wait until HaKadosh Baruch Hu has rachmanas enough. Now, in the Drishas Tzion, Rabbi Kneger brings, the Rav Tzir Kalisha brings it back and forth. He has 3 or 4 more follow-up letters that he has with Rabbi Kneger, where he's miyashiv certain of these pratim that Rabbi Kneger is ma'ir. But the ones that he's not miyashiv are the ones that Rabbi Kneger never talked about. So Rabbi Kneger clearly didn't hold, b'shleimus inyan, but he talked about something. Now, Rabbi Kneger was very old, and he referred him to the Chassam Sofer, to his Eidim, and the Chassam Sofer similarly. The Chassam Sofer is not nispal from the things that bother Rabbi Kneger, but is bothered by other things. The Chassam Sofer writes about the kahuna aspect. He's not so taken by it. But there's a problem with who pays for karbanis. Karbanis have to come from the tzibur. Shkalim doesn't apply anymore. So Chassam Sofer says maybe Karban Pesach that doesn't need shkalim, it can be possible to do. So now Rav Tzir Kalisha signs on. Chassam Sofer says we could do it again because Chassam Sofer again leaves out a whole bunch of parts. Now the one who actually was more on board with it in a real way was Rabbi Leo Gutmacher, which was his friend and chavrusa from learning by Rabbi Kneger. They were friends from Minu Uram. And Rabbi Leo Gutmacher was more open to the idea. Rabbi Leo Gutmacher was more of a Kabbalistically oriented person. He was a Mekubal. He loved the concept, all the Nevi'im, the Psukim, the Rayas that they're bringing. He was more open to the idea. The Aruch LaNer, for example, in the Tshuva and Binyan Tzion and Tshuva Aleph, is strongly against. The Aruch LaNer holds all his Rayas are not Rayas, and he goes through them one by one. He doesn't like his Rayas. Now, and there's, I'll give you a summary in a second of different, Seif Kol Seif, what are all the issues that are discussed. But this idea that Rav Tzir Kalisha ignored a little bit the nuance of these tshuvas that were sent to him because of his great chavivus and excitement to do it, really comes from the Sheilas David, from Rav David Karliner. Rav David Karliner put out a kuntras called Kuntras Rishas Tzion v'Yerushalayim in the Hakdama to his Sheilas Tshuva Sheilas David. He writes as follows. I want to read you a little bit of a quote over here. He says, "V'amarti bilvavi." He says, I heard of this idea that people want to bring Karbanos Mizanazeh, and I assumed that this was just words. People are talking because of the chavivos and the chshivas that they have. They're excited to discuss this topic, he says. Talking and learning is very good, he says. But because you think you have a psasvara, we're not going to do like that. Until I heard I found that there are people who are mamish, they're doing it for real. And he's referring to Rav Nassim Friedlander, who was a Talmud of Rav Tzir Kalisha, who moved to Eretz Yisrael. Rav Tzir Kalisha's son, they moved to Eretz Yisrael to try to bring this thing to life. Rav Tzir Kalisha himself never made it to Eretz Yisrael. They moved there to try to bring it to life. He says, I heard that this is becoming real, he says. He says, and I can't believe because you have a psepilpul doesn't mean you could do something. What is this that's going on over here that people like are going to act because of a svara that they have? Fine, this is his thing. Now he turns his attention to Tzvir Kalisher, and he says as follows. He says, then it came across my desk, Neged Einai Chibur Katan, Rav HaEchas, Midarshe B'Shleim Tzion, HaMesavim Lales B'Chatzereim. From someone who's Derish B'Shleim Tzion, who has a tremendous taiva to go up to Eretz Yisrael, Hu Harav Hagoyin, Yiris Elikim Merabim, Mereinu Harav Tzvi Hersh, HaMachona Kalisher. So he says, Rebbe Tzvi Kalisher was Yirei Shemayim Merabim, a Klar Yirei Shemayim, V'Reisi Me'achibur Hazeh, Imki Mechaber Hu Gadol B'Torah B'Yira, B'Yiras Chet HaKedemus L'Chachmasai, Im Kol Zeh Meroiv Ahavasai, L'Choinin Ad Mastiyan Yishke B'Zeh. And this is how he writes it. He says, I see that he's a Yirei Shemayim, he's a Yarei V'Shalom, he's a Taira Talmud Chacham. But Meroiv Ahavasai, to the Inyan, he was Shoigin and he wasn't able to see it through to the end. So the Shelas David is the one who put this cap on it. He's a little bit later than everybody else. He's already in the late 1800s, and he goes through. It's a contrast. It's small. It's readable. Rather, it's just a bad print, but it's readable. Where he goes through the different dinyanim that are impediments to bringing Kabbalas B'Zman Hazeh, and he says that although Rebbe Tzvi Kalisher was a Yirei Shemayim Mushlam, a Talmud Chacham, a Shleimistik Mensch, it was Meiroi V'Havasi for the idea that he wasn't able to really address all the issues. And similarly, the Tzitz Liezin, I think I quoted this last week, in two or three of his chuvas where he discusses the Inyan, he writes like that. I'll read you it because he writes it in a modern way. He says, Shalalacha b'zeh hochra yidei roiv minyan v'roiv binyan shal Rabbi Seinu Agdeilim ha'achreinim zal. V'toichem gami talmidav shalach sam sefer ba'atzmai. Ki mekama v'kama nimukim halacha yikreinim machriim ein ba'afsharas lahatas kamanas l'maisa. Says it's settled law. L'maisa, there is no way to do this in a practical sense. Yes, it would be nice. Yes, there's all sorts of rationales. Yes, there's all different chuvas from different gedolei achreinim that seem to, like a certain part of it, don't like a certain part of it, but there's no way to do it. And he says this in another chuva, Yefshel hakav kavanas b'nam zeh b'shum oifin shabaylam. Now, so Tzim Seif, I just want to say that it was an idea that started in a moment of time when he thought there would be a chance. It's something that was never going to be realistic, and like the Tzim Sefer writes in his chuva, when Rebbe Kivegi referred him to the Tzim Sefer writes that I just received word from people who are on the ground in Eretz Yisrael, and it's mamash not practical. It's not the time, he says, and the Sefer writes, this is interesting, the Sefer writes that I just received as a gift, like a lithograph, a painting of the Har HaBayis, and on it is a beautiful mosque, he says, with a beautiful dome, and there's no way, they're very protective over it, and there's no way that they'll ever let you do anything on Har HaBayis. So the Sefer knew more facts on the ground, what was going on, and he knew this was not realistic, b'chal. He says, Tzir Nifla Mikol Har HaBayis v'hanivna olav toicha gam akipa hanal. Also that dome of the mosque. When a Nifla l'royav, it's like a marvelous thing to see. So Sefer was very blown away by this artifact that he received. Now, l'shleimus einyan l'chayr, the way the Shelas Tzion says it, the way the Shelas David says it, and the way the Tzitz Liezin says it, is the way that it was left off. No mainstream gadol Tzim Seif was holding by allowing Karbanos B'Zman Hazeh. Now, just so that we're not leaving this untouched, I'll run through mamash quickly the various different discussion points without going into each one of them. Discussion point number one is there's a machlekes amongst these achronim if you need a navi v'sanhedrin to be mechadesh Karbanos. There's mashmayis in certain psukim that you need a navi and sanhedrin to be mechadesh Karbanos. The Chasam Sefer, although he is very favorable to Rebbe Tzvi Kalisher in his tshuva, and a different tshuva in Orach Chaim, he says clearly that you need a navi and sanhedrin to be mechadesh Karbanos. That's shiloh number one. The Kedushas Makam HaMikdash is a machlekes Rishonim. The Rambam, the Ravid, the Aruch LaNer brings that Rashi elsewhere seems to hold like the Ravid, so it's not even a machlekes that's really, behechrich. There was no hachra to that shiloh. Also, the Aruch LaNer suggests that maybe you can't rely on regular klali apsak to paskin such a shiloh, something that's tali in a navi. Meaning something that a navi is going to have input on, like the pasuk says, "Hakol b'yad Hashem alai hiskel." Neviim have input in what the Beis Hamikdash is going to look like. Don't tell me that stam machlekes or Elazar or Yitzchak halachic or Elazar. Like you can't tell me regular klali apsak by something that relies on a navi. That's the Aruch LaNer suggestion. There's obviously the shaila of going on to the Har HaBayis betumah b'zman hazeh. What type of tumah do we have? When is it tchuya? Is tumah hutter b'rabim? Dechuya b'rabim? That's a great sugya. Do you need the tzitz to be meratza when it is dechuya? Each one of these is really a conversation farzich based on many gemaras, many rishonim. Another one is the makam of mizbeach. How easy or hard or impossible is it to figure out where the mizbeach is supposed to be exactly? The Tzvi Kalisher held that it's easy to figure out the mizbeach is there are certain remnants of the Beis Hamikdash that are left, and based on the archaeology, you'll be able to figure it out. Others, the Aruch LaNer, the Kiveger, the Chasam Sefer seem to think that the pasuk says after the Korban Abayis Hasheni, Aru Ara the Yisoid Ba, that it was destroyed till the Yisoidis, and anything that's there now is not, actually from the Beis HaMikdash, and it would be hard to establish exactly where it is. This machlekes rages on today. Today there are people who say based on satellite imagery they could figure out better, v'dai, but there's more to say Bizman Hazeh. Now another one is Stam Psukim. Are Karbanos allowed to be brought when they're not L'Reach Nichayach? Karbanos are always referred to as Reach Nichayach. Now, the pasuk says when HaKadosh Baruch Hu was, when I think Yirmiyah is Menaba on the Korban, it says V'lo Yariach Reach Nichayachechem. I'm not going to smell anymore your Reach Nichayach. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kilo said, I'm no longer interested in the Reach Nichayach of Karbanos for the time being. Now, there's never been a pasuk where a Navi said that Hashem said, now I am interested again in Reach Nichayachim. Now, could you separate Karbanos from Reach Nichayachim? Say there's dinim of Karbanos. You could bring Karbanos because it's technically feasible, even if it's not Reach Nichayach. That's another machlekes in amongst the Achreinim. Kehanim Yuchasim we mentioned. There's Kreger's major point of contention, which is something that's still rages on today in many different contexts. Exactly how to look at Kehanim Bizman Hazeh. When you can make it, when you can't be make it. That's a great machlekes Achreinim that still goes on. Big Day Kahuna. What exactly the avnate of a kohen hedit is versus the avnate of a kohen gadol, if there's shatness in it, if there's tchelis in it, when it's mutter, when it's not mutter, and these are some of the greatest hits. It would take weeks and weeks to go through each one of these with the pratim, but this is the story of Tzvi Kalisher's. I dreamed the dream he wanted, but like the Tzitz Eliezer and like the Sheilus David says, it's miroiv abba v'chiba to pursue this idea so thoroughly, but it's not an idea that's practical. And I saw Reb Moshe Steinbach writes that the ultimate drishas tzion that a person could have is to talk through the sugya of being derish tzion. So hopefully we mekayim that. All right.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.